Welcome back to Coursera. This is Lecture 5 about the anatomy of the upper limb. For this and a couple of lectures beyond this, we're going to concentrate on the organization of the innervation of the upper limb. We're going to talk about how the pattern of innervation provides a mechanism to innervate muscles that are found in the upper limb, the skin that covers them, and the joints at which these muscles act. So let's start with the basics, like this old slide from the Penn Anatomy syllabus from years gone by. But it's a very simple slide which will help us understand the basic organization of the nervous system. The nervous system fundamentally consists of two parts. There's a central nervous system, which literally means brain and spinal cord, the brain being housed in and protected by the bones of the skull, the spinal cord being housed inside and protected by bones that make up the vertebral column. Arising from a part of the brain inside the skull and or arising from the spinal cord are a series of pairs of nerves, either cranial nerves or spinal nerves. And these nerves, since they enter or exit from the brain, form a component of the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. So the PNS, by definition, contains 12 pairs of cranial nerves, largely named because they exit through a hole in the skull and innervate muscles, skin, glands, and so on and so forth that lie in the area of head or neck. And 31 pairs of spinal nerves whose job it will be to innervate muscles, skin, and so on that make up the trunk, and, particular relevant to our conversation, providing a mechanism to innervate a limb, such as the upper limb. So certainly our emphasis is going to be on the anatomic organization of the nerves that are arising from the spinal cord, because they're going to be the ones that we're associating with the innervation of the upper limb. And as we're going to see, first off in this slide, the 31 pairs of spinal nerves are kind of named for the region of the spinal cord from which they enter or exit. And adding up the numbers, there are 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves, 5 lumbar pairs, 5 sacral pairs, and a single pair of coccygeal spinal nerves. So the spinal nerves that were going to be particularly relevant to us, because they serve as the innervators of the upper limb, will be several of the cervical spinal nerves and the first thoracic spinal nerve. Because we're going to see as we go forward in this conversation that the cervical spinal nerves that provide the innervation to the upper limb are the cervical spinal nerves C5, C6, C7, and C8, along with the first thoracic spinal nerve. So we are saying at the outset that there are going to be 5 pairs of spinal nerves, mainly those arising from cervical spinal cord, plus the T1 spinal nerve, that are going to provide the muscular and cutaneous and joint innervation of the entire upper limb. So now let's look at an isolated segment of the spinal cord, as if we plucked it out from any region of the cord, and it kind of gives us the anatomic sense of how the components or the roots of spinal nerves enter or exit from a spinal cord segment. So first off, this is the area of the spinal cord itself, so that technically is part of the central nervous system. And what you're seeing entering and exiting from a specific segment of the spinal cord are a series of what we'll call rootlets of a pair of spinal nerves. A series of rootlets. You can see some shown there in red and some shown there in blue. Because what we're going to see is that each pair of spinal nerves has a separate array of rootlets. One array of them shown in blue entering one side of the spinal cord segment in which they are associated, and a different array of them shown in red that is entering or exiting from a different side of the spinal cord. So this is basically what the anatomy of a spinal cord segment and its entering and exiting roots of a spinal nerve look like conceptually. So what does this really mean anatomically? Well, let's explore this further. First comment that we want to make is every spinal nerve, and we kind of make this point over here, consists of a combination of motor and sensory fibers, which means all spinal nerves are going to play a role in contraction of skeletal muscles, particularly muscles in a limb, and all spinal nerves are going to carry sensory fibers from the muscles that they innervate. Believe it or not, muscles have a sensory innervation, and from skin that covers those muscles. So it's easy to remember that every branch of a spinal nerve, not just including the ones that innervate the upper limb, consists of motor and sensory fibers. And as we'll see, all spinal nerves will give rise to a series of cutaneous branches and muscular branches that innervate muscles that act at joints of the upper limb and skin that covers them. But this helps us further define an individual spinal nerve, because now we can effectively say that each spinal nerve consists of a sensory root and a motor root. So what you're seeing here is an example, and I'll draw it out in red. These are examples of the entering sensory fibers that are entering the spinal cord segment in question in what is called a posterior or a dorsal root. Named because it's entering on the dorsal side or the posterior side of the spinal cord. Note that we are using the term dorsal and posterior synonymously. So every spinal nerve has a series of entering sensory fibers in the dorsal root. And by the same token, every spinal nerve contains some exiting motor fibers that have come out of the spinal cord that are going to exit in a anterior or a ventral root. Anterior or a ventral root. Again, we're using the term ventral synonymously with anterior. So by definition, what actually is a spinal nerve? A spinal nerve, and we said we have 31 pairs of them, is actually formed anatomically when the sensory fibers of the dorsal root join with the motor fibers of the ventral root. So my area indicated in blue right there is where a spinal nerve is. But the story's not over, because then the spinal nerves will continue to branch as they serve basically to innervate regions of skin and muscle in a specific region of the body. And spinal nerves will then tend to branch into a series of cutaneous nerves that innervate skin and muscular nerves that innervate muscle. And these are very specific territories of innervation by a spinal nerve. We describe a dermatome. The word tome means slice or cut. Derma means skin. So a dermatome is defined basically as the region of skin innervated by the branches of an individual spinal nerve. Whereas a myotome, the word myo prefix means muscle. A myotome is a specific region of skeletal muscle innervated by the branches of a muscular component of a spinal nerve. But without getting into the details, cutaneous nerves must be mixed, and they are, and muscular nerves must be mixed because we said that every spinal nerve and all of its branches has to contain both motor and sensory fibers, and they do. So it turns out, as I said, that muscles actually have a sensory innervation. So you know at any particular time where your limbs are positioned in space because of the sensory innervation that's coming from muscles. And there also are some motor structures in skin, such as sweat glands, that require a motor innervation that's carried in cutaneous nerves. So this is just a conceptual view illustrating the anatomy of an isolated spinal nerve, but it applies really to all of them. Now then, let's look at the fascinating array of spinal nerves that are providing the innervation to the upper limb. So first off, we've identified the specific spinal nerves that are providing this innervation. And to reprise that conversation, we know that it is 5 spinal nerves through their branching pattern that will provide the innervation of skin, muscles, and joints in the upper limb. And they include a continuous series of lower cervical spinal nerves, C5 through C8, and the T1 spinal nerve as well. But in this particular view, we're looking at the axilla, having removed all structures in it except for the nerves that traverse it. And we can see the fascinating interweaving branching pattern of the nerve fibers that are interweaving to form the innervation to the upper limb. So this interweaving of fibers that are traversing not only the neck but the axilla forms a fascinating branching pattern of the spinal nerves that innervate the upper limb called the brachial plexus. Again, the term brachial means arm, and we're kind of alluding to the fact by the terminology that this plexus, defined as an intermingling of adjacent nerve fibers, is found associated with the arm, and it certainly is. It's basically largely found in the axilla. So what's actually happening here? What's actually happening is that branches, specific branches of these 4 cervical spinal nerves and the T1 spinal nerve are intermingling. They're sharing their cutaneous and muscular branches with one another on an adjacent basis. But here's the net effect of the branching of the brachial plexus. What you see coming out of the brachial plexus are 5 terminal branches or peripheral nerves. And these 5 nerves, they are radial, median, ulnar, something called musculocutaneous, and something called the axillary. These 5 nerves will provide the bulk of the muscular and cutaneous innervation of muscles, skin, and joints in the upper limb. But the point of their organization is this: because of the intermingling of the brachial plexus, each of these nerves contains at least 2 spinal cord segments because of the sharing of the adjacent branches of the cervical spinal and the T1 spinal nerves that make up the plexus. So each of these peripheral nerves that are coming out of the branching of the brachial plexus contains at least 2 spinal cord segments. Why is that important? Because it means that every muscle in the upper limb that is innervated by these nerves is also going to be innervated by at least 2 spinal cord segments. And in a way, that's protective, because it means that if there were a traumatic injury that destroyed an entire component of the brachial plexus, let's say a traumatic lesion to the C5 spinal nerve, any muscle that's being innervated by the C5 spinal nerve will still work to a degree, because that same muscle will probably also be innervated by an intermingling of the C6 spinal nerve. So the function of the brachial plexus is really to provide an intermingling to protect the muscles that are being innervated by the brachial plexus nerves. So we're not going to get into the intricacies, basically, of the branching pattern, except to provide some basic organizational features of it, beyond the basic point that we want to make, that the nerves that come out of the brachial plexus at the other end, we call them the big 5, are formed by an intermingling of adjacent spinal cord segments and provide a mechanism that gives rise to a source of muscular innervation from at least 2 spinal cord segments carried by those nerves. All right, so here is a more accurate picture of the brachial plexus. And you can see the details of some of its branching patterns. As you can see that the branching pattern of the brachial plexus does not occur in isolation. the branches that are intermingling in the brachial plexus actually largely encompass the major artery that's supplying the upper limb, which in this position is called the axillary artery. So this is a classic atlas depiction of the innervation pattern of the upper limb as drawn in the Netter Atlas. But if we compare it to what we actually see in the cadaver, this is what medical students spend their time investigating by exposing the axilla, dissecting some muscles away from it, and the areas in yellow again mark the typical branching pattern of part of the brachial plexus as it intermingles and largely encompasses the axillary artery that's shown just behind these intermingling of these fibers. So what we're saying here is not only is the brachial plexus depicted accurately in atlas drawings, it also actually exists in its typical branching pattern as shown in this cadaveric dissection. So let's look basically in summary at what actually is happening. So here is just another way of explaining the brachial plexus. For example, you can see in this particular section that an individual spinal nerve, let's say C5, through the intermingling is providing its muscular branches into various nerves of the brachial plexus. In fact, it sends its axons into 3 major nerves that come out of the brachial plexus. It contributes to the nerve fibers in the axillary nerve, the musculocutaneous nerve, as well as in the radial nerve, okay, through the intermingling of the brachial plexus. Then finally, we can see that the radial nerve, looking at it another way, is a composite that is receiving contributions potentially from all 5 of the spinal cord segments that are providing its innervation. And what we're showing here is that the radial nerve basically sends sensory fibers back into all 5 of the spinal cord segments that are providing cutaneous innervation to the upper limb. So we can effectively say that the radial nerve participates in some way in the sensory innervation of parts of 5 dermatomes, again through the intermingling of the sensory fibers that make up the brachial plexus. Finally, using our digital atlas again, we can get more of a 3D perspective of the anatomy of the brachial plexus, which we just described. You can see, for example, how the fibers of the roots of the brachial plexus emerge from the neck, pass deep to the clavicle, and then enter and pass through the length of the axilla as they branch and intermingle, moving down certainly the length of the upper limb. And if we kind of outline some of them, we can see first off the branches of the radial nerve that is going to spiral around the shaft of the humerus, as you see here. Adjacent to that, we can see the branches of the other branches of the brachial plexus. A major one that's formed right there will be the median nerve. And over to the medial side of that, we can see the ulnar nerve. Again, as indicated before, you can see how all of these nerves, by example, are formed by a gradual intermingling of adjacent spinal cord segments, producing nerves that contain at least 2 segments of the individual spinal cord.